Hi, Jonathan York, Bay Financial Partners, looking at investment markets. A big fall in US interest rates as a weaker labour market starting to take some of the pressure off the sort of inflationary pressures out there. And also as well, potentially now investors are looking that, potentially the Fed might be looking at cutting rates slightly sooner than expected. So really quite a fall in some of those term rates. The 10 years back to 433 and the 2 years back to 477. Now just the beginning of last week, that 2 year was sort of nudging 5% and the 10 year was well above 450. Now that comes on the back of personal consumption expenditure, the Fed sort of preferred inflation gauge. That came in pretty much in line, maybe a tad weaker on some of the expectations at plus 0.2 to plus 0.3. And core running at 2.8. Now on the back of those numbers, the market looks like it's pricing in now maybe 1.5 cuts before year end. Whereas if you remember at the beginning of the year, they were looking at pricing in sort of 6 cuts by the end of this year. So certainly the scale of the cuts in the US has been sort of scaled back pretty dramatically. And you could argue and say that the economy at present doesn't really need rate cuts to stimulate the economy. It's still running along at a pretty reasonable rate, and inflation is coming down. I suppose the quandary for the Fed could be that if the ECB do cut rates later this month, they're going to be cutting rates with inflation running at around 2.4%. Now on the political scene, pretty dramatic occurrence with Donald Trump being found guilty on all 34 counts in his hush money trial. So as it stands at the present, he is a convicted criminal, and that's just going to be very interesting to see how that sort of sways on sort of voting numbers. Although quite ironically, he raised quite a bit of money after those guilty verdicts came through. Currently, it was raised around sort of 85 million. But the question still remains that, do you want a convicted criminal running the most powerful country in the world? Israel coming under increasing pressure still because they have still failed to sort of come into any sort of agreement on a sort of ceasefire or stop the military operations sort of occurring in the Gaza and also around Rafah. And the latest news is potentially friendly fire from Israelis might have killed a couple of their hostages, which is really putting increased pressure on Netanyahu to come up with some sort of solution. The problem is that his coalition government at present is pretty fractured, and the sort of hardliners there are saying no, there's no ceasefire. They've got to continue until Hamas is destroyed. Now oil's backed off again, back through 80 bucks, and again it's sort of hovering around that sort of 78 to sort of $82, I suppose, in a sort of a broad range. And really not getting sort of too carried away on either side, which is obviously pretty good news for the inflationary expectations for the global economy. Now in the UK, a pretty major event on the election, Nigel Farage, who was the sort of the Brexit orchestrator, has come out now and said that he will now be standing in the election. He will be standing as a potential MP for the Reform Party. Now that can be pretty damaging for the Conservatives, especially for the sort of right-wing Conservatives. And certainly Farage is campaigning on sort of a nationalistic anti-immigration policy, which, certainly with some of the sort of voters out there will carry quite a bit of sway. But potentially what it does do is just sort of weaken the sort of centre-right bloc, and that obviously will play into the hands of the Labour Party. So as we're now in the month of June, ECB is widely expected to cut interest rates, and as sort of discussed earlier, it's pretty interesting that they'll be cutting rates with inflation running at about 2.4%, and in the last month it may be nudged up just a little bit as well. But they have sort of signalled this cut for the last sort of couple of months, and really the big surprise will be if they didn't cut interest rates. Now in Australia, the latest CPI numbers was just a tad firmer, 3.6 versus 3.5, but still really nothing to get sort of too worried about. Maybe just sort of a seasonal sort of rounding sort of issues coming through on that inflation number. And after what the Reserve Bank came out with in sort of minutes last time round, that he didn't want to micromanage too much by putting up rates again, it appears that rates are on hold in Australia unless you see a big jump in inflation. And currently that doesn't seem to be on the cards. Now here in New Zealand, obviously the big news was the budget. That came in probably pretty much as expected. The government, National Party, obviously did manage to deliver on its tax cuts by just indexing those bands up. Nothing really too major out there. It was relatively sort of balanced, although sort of borrowing has increased just slightly. But that was obviously blamed on the previous government for a lot of sort of underfunding when the new coalition government came into power. And actually managed to get a good look at the books. Although potentially there's a little bit of good news out there for the dairy sector. Initial indications from Fonterra. So a price of around sort of $7.25 to $8.75 initial for the 2024-2025 season. So if you take a mid-priced out of $8, that's a reasonable sort of starting point. But then the tourist sector has just suffered a little bit of a blow here with P&O, one of the largest sort of cruise operators, has announced that from sort of February 2025, it will cease operations sailing out of New Zealand. Now that's obviously a pretty big blow. There will be some cruise ships still coming into New Zealand, but they won't actually be sort of starting here and departing from here, which is a little bit of a blow. One of the reasons put forward was the regulatory requirements here in New Zealand, which a lot of the companies have been sort of complaining about over the last sort of year or so. Now whether the new government is able to sort of streamline that and potentially get them back, we wait to see. So with P&O pulling out, potentially for some of the sort of smaller ports, that's really a pretty big blow. So if you are looking for income options, go to the website www.bayfinancialpartners.co.nz for lots of interesting articles. I look forward to speaking to you soon.